By 2008, saying you carried a BlackBerry meant something. Bankers slept with it under their pillow. Senators refused to give theirs up, even for security briefings. $80 billion sat on top of one idea. A keyboard so good, it made email feel like breathing. Then a phone with no keyboard outsold it, out-innovated it, outlived it. Inside RIM's headquarters, one decision, made in a single afternoon, decided which future the company would inherit. The people who made it were not fools. They were the smartest engineers in the industry, and they were about to be wrong at a cost of $80 billion. The story of BlackBerry does not begin with a phone. It begins with a pager, a small black rectangle with a wheel on its side, sold to executives who wanted email without wires. In 1999, Research in Motion, a modest Canadian company based in Waterloo, Ontario, released the RIM 850, a device that could send and receive email over a wireless network for the first time, small enough to fit in a shirt pocket. The idea was not glamorous. It solved one narrow problem: getting messages to people away from their desks. That narrow problem quietly and slowly became the seed of an entire empire. The mechanism was deceptively simple: a physical keyboard so precise, so responsive, that typing on it felt closer to writing than to tapping. Each key curved slightly, tuned to the shape of a human thumb. Underneath it sat something more valuable still: military-grade encryption, routed through RIM's own private servers, so every email passed through security no rival could match. Governments trusted it. Banks trusted it. Lawyers trusted it. By the early 2000s, BlackBerry devices were the only consumer electronics permitted inside the White House Situation Room. No other device on the market could make that claim, and RIM's engineers knew it and built their entire roadmap around protecting it. The nickname came from the users themselves. Crackberry, only half joking, because the addiction was real. Executives checked it at dinner, during meetings, during their children's school plays. It was not a phone that happened to send email. It was an email machine that, almost as an afterthought, could also make calls. That distinction mattered. It explains why RIM's engineers built everything around the keyboard and the inbox, and almost nothing around entertainment, media, or touch. A camera felt like an afterthought. A web browser felt like a courtesy. The inbox was the product, and everything else was decoration around it. Trained typists could send a full paragraph without looking down, thumbs moving in a rhythm outsiders found hypnotic to watch. RIM tested dozens of plastic compounds for the keys, chasing a tactile snap without adding a single unnecessary gram. That obsession, multiplied across a customer base of professionals typing hundreds of messages a day, built a loyalty no marketing budget could buy. By 2007, the numbers told a story of near-total dominance. 70% of the American smartphone market. Stock climbing from under $2 a share to over $140. A market valuation approaching $80 billion. Subscriber numbers passed 10 million, doubling every 18 months. Every carrier's enterprise pitch ran on one sentence: "This device runs BlackBerry." Congress ran on it. The Obama campaign ran on it. Wall Street ran on it. There was no serious competitor in sight. Because RIM had not built a phone company. It had built an operating system for corporate trust. And trust, at that scale, felt unassailable, permanent, almost impossible to lose. The National Security Agency approved BlackBerry for government use years before any rival phone cleared the same review. Law firms handling privileged communication standardized on it. Investment banks issued it to every analyst on the floor because a leaked email meant a lawsuit, and RIM's encryption meant that leak almost never happened. This was not a company selling a lifestyle. It was selling certainty, one encrypted message at a time. And certainty, in an industry built on liability and compliance, commanded a premium no-touchscreen novelty seemed capable of threatening. That certainty hardened into something harder to shake: assumption. Co-CEOs, Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsillie, had spent a decade solving one problem better than anyone: moving small packets of secure data over a slow, unreliable network. Battery life mattered more than screen size. Keyboard travel mattered more than graphics. Network efficiency mattered more than anything resembling entertainment. It was a philosophy that made RIM rich, and one that made an oversized, keyboardless phone feel not just unnecessary, but irresponsible. Every engineering decision inside the company ran through that same narrow lens, and it had never once let them down. So when rumors surfaced in late 2006 that a rival with no history in mobile hardware was building a phone with a screen you touched, RIM's engineers did not panic. They ran the numbers on battery drain and called it a novelty. A full glass front, no physical keys. It seemed to violate everything they understood about how professionals used a phone. Reliability, they believed, would always beat delight. Nobody in Waterloo asked the one question that would define the next decade. What if the customer did not want what RIM had spent 10 years perfecting? If you want to know exactly what happened next, stay subscribed, because the decision that answered that question was made in a single afternoon by people who never imagined it would end an $80 billion empire. January 9th, 2007. Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and held up a black slab of glass. No keyboard, no stylus. One button, beneath a screen that answered a fingertip. An operating system built on the idea that a phone could feel like software, not hardware. Inside Waterloo, a small group of engineers watched the keynote on a delayed feed. The reaction was not fear. It was closer to relief. No keyboard, no removable battery. A screen that would drain in hours under real use. To men who had spent a decade perfecting battery efficiency, it looked like a toy built by people who had never shipped a phone, let alone a phone that had to survive a full workday of real, constant use. Mike Lazaridis, RIM's co-CEO and its most respected engineer, took an iPhone apart within days of its release. He found exactly what he expected. Battery life sacrificed for a bigger screen. Physical buttons sacrificed for fragile glass. Network efficiency sacrificed for raw processing power. Every choice Apple made was, from RIM's perspective, a mistake. Lazaridis told colleagues the phone would not survive real cellular networks at scale, that AT&T's infrastructure would buckle, that professionals who typed fast would never trade a keyboard for a pane of glass. Every prediction was defensible. Almost everyone turned out wrong. Years of being right had taught the entire executive team to trust that instinct without question, and nothing in their experience had ever punished that trust before. The logic was not irrational. RIM had spent a decade compressing data before it reached a cell tower, squeezing enterprise email through connections too slow for a full web browser. The iPhone assumed a world of fast, cheap wireless bandwidth that did not exist yet in 2007. From inside Waterloo, betting against that assumption looked like sound engineering, not stubbornness. The problem was the assumption itself was about to become obsolete, and nothing in RIM's models accounted for how fast carriers would upgrade once a device worth streaming video on actually existed. Nobody had built a model that priced in how quickly an entire industry could change its mind. This was the fork. On one side, physical keys, conservative battery use, encrypted enterprise email, a customer base that valued function over flash. On the other, an unproven touchscreen ecosystem built around consumer delight, third-party apps, a browser that treated the internet as something to enjoy rather than triage. RIM did not need to choose immediately. It could have hedged, built a touchscreen device in parallel while keyboard sales stayed strong. Some engineers pushed for exactly that, arguing internally that a small parallel team could test the concept without risking the core business. The decision, when it came, was not to hedge. RIM's leadership decided the iPhone was a niche consumer product that would never threaten the enterprise market. Resources went into refining what already worked, not chasing what didn't yet. When RIM finally shipped a touchscreen device, the BlackBerry's Storm, in late 2008, the software was so unfinished, reviewers called the touch response laggy and the interface half-built. Verizon, the carrier that bet its answer to the iPhone on the Storm, took back devices by the hundreds of thousands. Customers said the screen simply would not register a tap. The device that was supposed to prove RIM could compete on Apple's own terms instead proved the opposite, and it did so publicly, in front of the exact enterprise. Customers the company was trying to reassure. The second decision mattered more than the first. Apple paired its touchscreen with something RIM had no answer for. An app store opened July 2008, letting outside developers build software and reach millions overnight. RIM's own developer platform stayed clunky and restrictive for years, its approval process driving away the very independent developers building the games and social apps starting to define what a smartphone was for. BlackBerry still meant email. It still meant security. But to a growing share of buyers, a phone that couldn't run the same apps as an iPhone felt like a relic. Teenagers who had never sent a corporate email in their lives were picking phones by which games they could carry, a buyer RIM had never designed for, and for years did not seem to notice existed. Every quarter the App Store grew. That gap widened a little further, quietly, without a single headline announcing it. RIM's executives made their call in an afternoon of confident engineering logic, certain that a full decade of being right would outlast one loud, unproven idea from a computer company that had never sold a phone. The market spent years proving them wrong, one quarter at a time, and by the time anyone inside Waterloo was willing to say so out loud, much of that time had already run out. By 2010, the numbers moved in a direction RIM's engineers had never modeled. 70% of the American market, 3 years earlier. 37% now. A year later, 16%. Apple's iPhone and a rising wave of Android devices from Samsung, HTC, Motorola were not just winning new customers. They were pulling existing ones away, one contract renewal at a time. RIM's stock, which had peaked above $140 a share in 2008, slid towards $70 by 2010. It kept falling. By the summer of 2012, shares that once traded above $140 changed hands for under $7, more than 95% of the company's peak value erased in barely 4 years. A full and quiet decade of dominance had compressed itself into a single brutal chart. The decline showed up first in the numbers analysts tracked every single quarter. Then, more painfully, in the ones that measured loyalty rather than raw sales. Net subscriber additions, the figure RIM had used for a decade to prove its platform was growing, turned negative for the first time in company history, in 2012. Losing the battle for new customers was one difficult thing. Watching existing ones walk away, quarter after quarter, with no sign of reversal anywhere on the horizon, was something else entirely. The defections were not abstract. In 2011, large enterprise clients that had built entire IT departments around BlackBerry's encrypted email began quietly piloting iPhones and Android devices, unthinkable 5 years earlier. Government agencies in Britain and the United States, once the company's most loyal customers, started issuing employees a choice of devices instead of mandating BlackBerry outright, a quiet policy shift that would have been unthinkable at the height of the company's dominance. Even Halifax, one of RIM's own hometown institutions in Canada, let staff use personal iPhones for work email. A small decision, an outsized signal. The company's most natural allies no longer saw BlackBerry as the only serious option. The failed product that crystallized the crisis was the Playbook, a tablet rushed to market in April 2011 to answer the iPad. It shipped without a native email application, an omission so strange that reviewers struggled to understand how a company built entirely on email had released a device that could not check it without tethering to a nearby BlackBerry phone. Sales were dismal. RIM manufactured roughly 1 million units, expecting quick sellouts at flagship retailers. Fewer than half moved in the following months. The company took a charge of hundreds of millions, writing down unsold inventory sitting in warehouses, marked down again and again just to clear shelf space before the next holiday season. Retailers that had cleared prime shelf space for the launch, expecting numbers to rival the iPads, found themselves discounting a tablet nobody wanted at any price close to what it had cost to build. Leadership itself began to fracture. Co-CEOs Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsillie, who had run the company in tandem since its founding, faced mounting criticism from investors who argued the dual structure had made RIM slow to respond to a market moving faster than either man wanted to admit. In 2011, activist shareholders began openly calling for both to step down, publishing open letters attacking the company's strategy and its endless product delays. The following year, both resigned, replaced by Thorsten Heinz, a RIM veteran inheriting a company already losing the war for developer attention, consumer trust, and carrier support. The two men who had built the empire from a single wireless pager were, within a few short years, unable even to agree with their own board on what the company should build next. The point of no return arrived quietly, almost invisibly, in the accumulation of missed deadlines rather than a single dramatic headline. BlackBerry 10, the operating system meant to finally answer the iPhone and Android, had been promised for 2011. Delayed to 2012. Finally released in January 2013, nearly 6 years after Steve Jobs first held up a slab of glass in San Francisco. By then, the market had already spent half a decade building habits, app libraries, and social networks around competing platforms. Early sales fell well below even RIM's own reduced expectations. Within months, the company wrote off nearly $1 billion in unsold Z10 inventory. Layoffs followed in waves, cutting thousands of jobs across successive rounds through 2013. Waterloo's downtown, once filled with buses shuttling employees between RIM buildings at every hour, grew visibly quieter. The empire that had once commanded 70% of a market now fought to hold single digits. Executives no longer spoke of competing with Apple. They spoke of surviving. Analysts who had once debated whether RIM or Apple would define the next decade of mobile computing stopped asking the question entirely because there was no longer a real debate to have. By 2016, the company that once controlled $80 billion in market value announced it would stop designing its own smartphones entirely. BlackBerry, the name that had defined mobile email for a decade, would continue only as a software and licensing brand, its handsets built by outside manufacturers under contract. The devices that once sat in the pocket of every senator, every banker, every executive who valued security over spectacle were gone. What remained was a logo, a patent portfolio, a cybersecurity division quietly serving governments that still valued the encryption RIM had built its name on decades earlier. The company was not even called Research in Motion anymore. It had renamed itself BlackBerry Limited back in 2013, quietly retiring the founder's original name along with almost everything the founders once believed about how a phone should work. It is tempting to tell this as a simple story of a company that failed to see the future coming. That is not quite what happened. RIM's engineers saw the iPhone. They studied it, took it apart, understood exactly what it was. What they could not see was that the confidence which built their empire, a decade of being right about batteries, keyboards, network efficiency, was the same confidence that made them unable to imagine being wrong about anything else. The keyboard that made BlackBerry indispensable became the reason executives could not picture a customer who might prefer glass. Other companies faced the same fork, chose differently. Samsung, which had built its early business on candy bar phones, not unlike BlackBerry's own lineup, watched the iPhone launch and moved the opposite direction. Within a year, it had committed serious engineering resources to touchscreens, partnering with Google's Android to build an ecosystem that could compete directly with Apple's. Nokia, the world's largest phone maker at the time, made a choice closer to RIM's, betting its own operating system and design language would hold the market. Nokia's mobile business collapsed almost as completely as RIM's, sold to Microsoft in 2014 for a fraction of what it had once been worth. Its once dominant Symbian software abandoned within a few short years of that sale. The lesson was never that touchscreens were destined to win. It was that refusing to test an uncomfortable idea against real customers in real time carries a cost that compounds every quarter it goes unpaid. Samsung survived the fork because it was willing to be wrong quickly and cheaply, shipping imperfect early Android phones and iterating in public, rather than waiting for a design worthy of its reputation. The deeper lesson sits underneath the dates. BlackBerry did not lose because RIM built bad products. Every phone the company shipped in 2007, 2008, even 2009 worked exactly as designed, often better than its rivals, at the one job it was built for. BlackBerry lost because the company optimized so completely for the customer it already had that it stopped being able to see the customer it was about to lose. The keyboard, the encryption, the battery efficiency, all of it was a monument to solving yesterday's problem with total mastery, built by people convinced that yesterday's problem was also tomorrow's. There is a symmetry worth sitting with. In a boardroom in Waterloo, a small group of engineers once watched a stage in San Francisco and saw a fragile, battery-hungry toy with no keyboard. They were the smartest people in their industry, and they were certain. Years later, in that same city, empty offices and quiet parking lots stood where thousands once rushed between meetings, building a product the world had already decided it no longer needed. A device that started as a pager solving one narrow problem grew into an $80 billion empire and ended the same way empires usually do. Not with a single dramatic collapse, with 1,000 small decisions to keep doing what had always worked, made by people who had every reason, on paper, to believe they were right. What survived was not the hardware. It was the pattern. Every company that has since mistaken its own past success for a permanent advantage, every organization that has dismissed an uncomfortable idea because it violated what its engineers already knew to be true, has walked some version of the path RIM walked between 2007 and 2013. The keyboard felt like the future, right up until the moment it very obviously was not. Somewhere, right now, in an industry that feels every bit as settled as mobile phones felt back in 2006, another company is almost certainly making its own version of that afternoon decision, confident, well-reasoned, and quietly wrong. If this story of how one confident decision can end an $80 billion empire was worth your time, there are more like it waiting. The subscribe button is the easiest way to make sure you do not miss the next one.